لقاءات في مؤسسة شومان غنية بالأفكار وقيمة بالحوارات. ولقائنا هذا المساء مع الدكتور صفوان المصري، والحوار والأسئلة والمداخلات من الجمهور الكريم حتماً ستثرينا جميعاً وستثري الكاتب أيضاً. جلستنا اليوم ستدار باللغة الإنجليزية مع وجود الترجمة الفورية، والسبب يعود إلى أن الكتاب نشر باللغة الإنجليزية من دار نشر جامعة كولومبيا. Dr. Safwan Masri's educational and professional accomplishments are too many to go through. He is armed with a doctorate degree in industrial engineering, a field in which he worked and excelled for more than a decade. As a colleague, I have known Safwan to be very smart, consistently driven, and someone who really applies himself. And while I'm certain he was a brilliant engineer in his past career, it is what he did after that that brings us together tonight. In this chapter of his life, he brings value added to global affairs on an international stage. A win-win thinker, he is at once a synergizer and a synthesizer. He brings people together to think, to effect change, and invariably, the outcome always exceeds the sum of the parts. It is his interest in education that has brought about this metamorphosis. Indeed, his book comes from a place of passion, a passion for exploring, for learning, for teaching, for contributing, and for leaving a mark. He is curious, and he is a lifelong learner. But a caveat is in order here. Dr. Masri will tell you, he's not a historian, he's not a social scientist, nor a political scientist. He is not Hisham Sharabi, and he is not Walid al-Khaldi. But neither has he sought to be in writing this book. Yet, like these scholars, in applying himself, Safwan is a pursuer of excellence. The book is an attempt to be the best version of himself, the best version of Safwan, who was born and raised in Jordan, who studied in America, who spent his early years in a very competitive field, in a very competitive city, and who proved himself despite all the odds. He comes back to the region because he is interested in it, because he cares for it, because he worries about it, and because he wants it to flourish. His life has been a series of challenges in many ways. And when you have been through challenges, you know where you stand on issues. Tonight, he shares his view as to where Tunis is 6 or 7 years after giving birth to the Arab Spring, and why, sadly, he considers it an anomaly in the Arab world. Please help me welcome Dr. Safwan al-Masri.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very, very, very much. Thank you, Rania. This was an incredibly generous, but I know genuine introduction from the heart. I'm really humbled by this phenomenal introduction. Rania and I have known one another for a very, very long time and have worked alongside one another, and thank you. You've really honored me. You've honored me with your presence this evening. I'm really privileged to be having conversation with you. I will speak for a while, and then I hope that we can take a few questions so that we can enter into a conversation. Once again, I'll add to what Rania has said, and forgive me for using English. يعني Arabic is my mother tongue, وأنا ابن البلد, طبعا لغتي, بس the book has been published in English, and we have a lot of English speakers here with us this evening. Rania said that the conversation will enrich us, and I put myself first amongst the us, because I'm always looking for ideas to be challenged, and I'm looking for opportunities for us to enter into a conversation. So let me start by saying a couple of things about why I wrote this book. In many ways, this is a very personal book, and it was really, it has signaled a new chapter in my life, as you've put it, Rania, but I don't consider it a discontinuity. I see it as part of a continuum. I grew up in Jordan. I was born in Jordan. I went to school in Jordan. Then I left to the United States to pursue my studies, and I've been working at Columbia University for the past 30 years. And at Columbia, I've had a number of careers as a professor of business, applying my systems engineering background in the classroom, and then as a vice dean of the business school, before I took time out a dozen years ago to come back to Jordan to help establish King's Academy and then the Queen Rania Teacher Academy. And at that time, the president of the university, Lee Bollinger, engaged me in his global mission for the university. That mission has been driven by a quest for us to think about our relevance as a university in the 21st century in a far more global as opposed to international world. One of the outcomes of that thinking process was the establishment of global research and education centers. We set up the first one here in Amman, and now I oversee 9 of them around the world. The time I spent in Jordan, living and working in the period between 2006, 2007, and then around 2012, exposed me to a number of things, and to a number of things around me and to a number of things within me. I found myself in a struggle to sort of reconcile various parts of my identity, to reconcile different truths that I knew, to reconcile also the past with the present, let alone the future. And what I mean by that is spending time in Amman, unlike coming to visit once or twice a year to see family and friends, when I came here to work and I was exposed in a very real way to society and to education, which is a main pillar of any society, I found it very difficult to reconcile what I was experiencing in Amman with the Amman I grew up in the 1960s and 1970s. And as I traveled within the region, Cairo, Beirut, and Amman, and other cities within the region that I was experiencing were very different than the ones that I had grown up in. And I'll come back to that theme and I'll explain it. But there was a search process that had started. And I started really looking at, in particular, what role had education played in getting us to where we are or we were in this part of the world, in Jordan and the larger region. And I started looking at the intersection between education and the hegemony of religion. And I really want to emphasize this. It's not religion, but it's the hegemonic role of religion in society and education systems. The various other factors that shape the education systems that we now have at our schools, the intersection between those and society and politics on the other hand. Then the Arab Spring happened. And when the Arab Spring happened, and as we all know, it started in Tunis with the self-immolation of Mohammed Bouazizi on December 17, 2010. And then Tunisia continued to surprise us. You know, in 2011, on January 14, Ben Ali is ousted. Tahrir Square happens. Cairo seems to be on a similar trajectory to the one that Tunis had been on. But then elsewhere in the region, we see a sort of a deterioration of a situation and the ramping up of humanitarian crises, whether we are talking about Libya or Yemen or most poignantly and closest to us in the case of Syria. In Egypt, we saw the very short period of hope come to an end, and what seemed like a democratic society in the making gave way to a military dictatorship. But Tunisia, throughout that process, continued to surprise us. So in 2011, we had Constituent Assembly elections. Out of the elections, you had a troika coalition of 3 disparate parties, one of them an Islamist party, come together to share power and to safeguard the gains of the revolution that had succeeded. Then in 2013, we thought that things were going to break apart. 2 political assassinations, Shukri Bilaid and Mohammed Brahmi. But then we had 4 civil society organizations come together. One of those civil society organizations led by a woman, Widad Bouchamawi, and they form a quartet that negotiates Tunisia's way out of a crisis, and that works with Al-Nahda, which was the Islamist party at the time in charge of government, to withdraw from government, brings in a technocratic government that oversees the adoption of a new constitution in January of 2014, and then parliamentary and presidential elections later on in that year. So the question to me was the same question that many of us had, observing what was going on during that period. Why Tunisia? You know, why, when you have stagnation in a number of Arab countries and a deterioration into civil war and civil strife in other countries, how come Tunisia is able to pursue a path towards a peaceful democratic transition? And it's still pursuing that. You know, I'm not suggesting that it's all done and it's all over, and it's a very fragile democracy, but nonetheless, what happened during that 3-4 year period was really astonishing. And then there were analysts, many of whom I have great respect for, who started saying it happened in Tunisia, it can happen elsewhere in the Arab world. Tunisia can serve as a model for the rest of the Arab world. So I set out on a pursuit, on a quest, to try to answer the question, one, why Tunisia? You know, what caused Tunisia to be at this point? And secondly, can Tunisia serve as a model for the rest of the Arab world? What I wasn't aware of then was how much those questions meant to me personally. And I'll, again, come back to this because that is a theme that really is woven throughout my narrative in the book. So I started going to Tunis, and I had a theory, and my theory was when women's rights are more advanced than they are elsewhere in the region, when education is known to have always been more progressive and more modern and more advanced than it is elsewhere in the region, when you have civil society activism, the way that we witnessed in Tunisia, then perhaps, you know, there are real factors that can be explained by some of these ingredients that enabled the transition to democracy. And I found through my research and through multiple visits and secondary research and primary research through interviews and so on, that some of it was not surprising, okay? Some of it perhaps was surprising. So of course, everybody points to Habib Bourguiba. Everybody talks about leadership and vision. And, you know, I discover, yes, of course, Habib Bourguiba had a lot to do with it. But Habib Bourguiba did not descend on Tunis from Mars, and he did not operate in a vacuum. It turns out that much of what Habib Bourguiba did had been facilitated for him, not over the years, but over decades, and one may even say over centuries. So what did I find through my quest? I found that there are some luck factors that Tunisia benefited from. Okay, so environmental factors. Tunisia never had the resource burden of some Arab countries. Small country, 11 million, homogeneous, 98% are Sunni Muslim, okay? Detached, sort of, you know, somewhere in the Mediterranean, okay? Away from the centers of gravity of Arab intrigue and Arab conflict and, you know, conflict within the Arab world and conflict between the Arab world and the West and Israel in particular. Boundaries that had not shifted for hundreds of years, literally. I mean, the only other Arab country that can claim the same thing is Egypt, with the slight aberration in the 19th century when Sudan was part of Egypt and was not part of Egypt. But also, you know, other environmental factors that I think helped the country a great deal was its proximity to Europe, which also played a role in terms of the identity that it helped form. So that's one set of factors. Another is the identity that I found in Tunisia, an incredibly strong and confident identity, an identity that is not in conflict with itself, an identity that grew out of multiple civilizations that came through the country and formed the modern Tunisian the way that it did. A celebration of the Berber history that is not in tension with the celebration of the Arab and Muslim identity and culture that came with that. A celebration of the rich history of Carthage, and of Carthage being not only the seat of power during the pre-Roman days, but also during the Roman days. A celebration of the contributions to Christianity that were made during the latter days of the Roman Empire, and the combination of all of those things. And then I would add to that an experience with Islam that was very different than elsewhere. And I have to be careful because one of the chapters in the book is called Tunisian Islam. So I've been challenged on that. Do you mean that the Islam of Tunisia is different than the Islam that we are accustomed to elsewhere in the region or in the world? And I say absolutely not. It is Maliki, Sunni Islam. But the experience that Tunisia has had with Islam, which I talk about quite a bit in the book, from the early days of Qayrawan through the 19th century, which is really where the bulk of the story begins, to the modern day, and to the nature of political Islam in Tunisia, which I argue is a very different breed than political Islam personified in the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamist movements, was also a very, very important factor. Then we get to the factors that I think played the biggest role in what I argue prepared Tunisians for a democratic transition in a way that probably would not have been possible in other places such as Egypt. And when I say democratic transition, I want to also clarify something. Actually, I'll make two clarifications about democracy and education. By democracy, I don't mean only electoral democracy. I mean democracy of thought, okay? Democracy of opinion, democracy of rights, okay? So I mean democracy that is not reduced to going to the ballot box. That's a component of democracy, but I'm more interested, or I'm equally interested in the other aspects, the non-political aspects of democracy, okay? The freedom of thought, the freedom of expression, and other types of liberties. Also, when I talk about education, I don't necessarily mean performance of students on international standardized tests. And I see here in the room some of my colleagues who work in the field of education and with whom I collaborated. We spent so much of our energy focusing on TIMSS and PISA and other international tests. I couldn't care less about how students perform on those tests for me to define what a good education system is and what is not. To me, a good education system is one that cultivates curiosity, that cultivates values of toleration, of inclusion. A good education system is one that promotes independent thinking, analytical thinking, critical thinking. A good education system is one that is based and founded on the humanities and the liberal arts. So I wanted to get those two clarifications out of the way. So then I'll go back to my argument of what were the main factors, in my view, that led to a propensity for a democratic transition in Tunisia. And I present to you that those four factors are all interrelated. One is a rich history of civil society that is absent elsewhere in the Arab world. That civil society activism is rooted in a vibrant labor union movement that started in the 1920s. The modern labor union movement of Tunisia that is formed through the Union Générale Tunisienne de Travail, the General Union of Tunisian Workers, was founded in 1946 by Farhat Hashid. Farhat Hashid was assassinated in 1952 at the hands of a terrorist organization connected to the French state, Les Mains Rouges. it was the union movement was so intertwined with the nationalists, pro-independence movement of France, that Farhat Hashid was deemed by the French as the greatest threat to their French colonial interests in Tunisia. But that union has not only survived since 1946, it now has 150 branches around the country. It has enabled civil society activism in Tunisia in a way that really paid off during the transition period and also in the days of the revolution. And it has also brought to Tunisians practice with procedural democracy. Okay, so even though political parties were not really very serious and political pluralism was not really there during the reigns of Bourguiba and Ben Ali, Tunisians were accustomed to debate in the confines of the labor union movement, to elections, and to everything that happens within a procedural democracy. So civil society. Second is women. Okay? So in 1956, the year that Tunisia became independent of France, one of Habib Bourguiba's first acts in power was to implement a Code de Statut Personnel, مجلة الأحوال الشخصية, that gave women more rights than they enjoy today in any Arab country. As far as I can tell, it's the only Arab Muslim country where polygamy is outlawed, and polygamy has been outlawed since 1956. He gave women rights related to divorce, repudiation, child custody. 1957, women in Tunisia gained the right to vote. And it was not a big thing. It was not an announcement around it. There were municipal elections, and women were allowed to vote. So there was no suffrage the way that we experienced even in the United Kingdom or in the United States back in the 1920s. 1961, Tunisian women had access to birth control. 1965, Tunisian women had access to, actually, there was a mandate that they would have to abort if they already had 5 children. And in 1973, the same year as Roe versus Wade, abortion became fully legal. So reproductive health, the health of women, the participation of women in politics, in society, in the economy, was there from the very beginning. Now, what was interesting to me is what allowed that to happen, but I'll come back to that after I finish the factors. So you've got civil society, women. 3 is the moderation of the role of religion in society. Like Ataturk before him, who founded the state of Turkey in 1923, as you know, Bourguiba adopted a version of the laïcité Jacobean model of subjugating religion under the state. But unlike the case of Ataturk, where subjugation of religion to the state was really intended to abolish religion from the public sphere altogether, in Habib Bourguiba's case, it was a matter of moderating the role of religion in society. So, for example, Ataturk had taken out all classes having to do with religion from the Turkish curriculum. And now we see a little bit of a backlash, perhaps. In Tunisia, he allowed for teaching of religion, but that was limited to 2 hours a week. That was the case in 1958 when the education reform law was adopted, and that is the case today in 2017. He swept the rug from under the feet of the religious authorities. He made himself more of a religious authority than the religious authorities that were there. He eliminated Islamic judicial courts. He unified the judiciary in Tunisia. He eliminated Waqf because he wanted to monitor the funding that was going to religious organizations and how religious organizations often worked to diminish the rights of women, especially when it came to inheritance. And Zaytuna, from which a lot of the reform had emanated, he brought under the state's control the education facilities of Zaytuna Mosque. And in 1961, when he established the University of Tunis, he brought into it the faculty of theology from Zaytuna Mosque. So the mosque was not about education. The University of Tunis was about education. The public school system was about education. So we've got civil society, women, religion and the moderation of its role in society, and then fourthly, education. So when it came to education, Bourguiba declared it the second most important fight to win, second only to poverty. Okay, so the eradication of poverty was Tunisia's first fight, and then the second one was the implementation of a solid education system. He brought to lead the education system Mahmoud Mas'adi, a playwright who was part of the nationalist movement, who used actually the arts and plays to bring about a nationalist sense around the independence movement. Mahmoud Mas'adi, first and foremost, spent 10 years as Minister of Education. So the first Minister of Education was Minister of Education for 10 years. He had time to implement, he had time to monitor, he had time to adjust. Second, Bourguiba insisted on a bilingual education system. Bilingual for a number of reasons. One, so that French teachers could remain in the country while Tunisian teachers were trained to take on teaching positions at the schools. And I compare that with a number of other instances in the region, but let me take here, for the purposes of today's talk, Algeria. Algeria, after 132 years to be exact, of brutal French colonization. Independence is won in 1962 after millions of lives had been lost in the war for independence. It was natural for Algeria to emerge out of the war for independence with a rejection of everything French, the rejection of everything colonial, including the desire not to depend on the French for education, including in terms of teachers. Quick Arabization of the curricula, overnight Arabization of the curricula. So now you have an entire population with nobody to teach them because Algerian teachers were not yet qualified, right? You bring in Egyptian teachers. Many of them come with their own ideologies, depending on the time frame. They were coming with Nasserite ideologies and were acting as ambassadors for Jamal Abdel Nasser, or under Sadat, they would come with anti-Nasser ideologies, promoting Muslim Brotherhood ideologies. But in either case, it didn't really matter because Algerians couldn't understand them and they couldn't understand Algerians because the dialects were so different, and even within Algeria, you had very different dialects. Third, and in my view, and I'm going to be very candid and open, and the purpose of this book is to provoke and to provoke discussion, okay? Is that it opened the doors wide for the infiltration of narrow religious discourse to overtake everything in the curricula, okay? Bourguiba knew this. So one reason is that he wanted to retain French teachers. Two, because he knew that Tunisians had to be strong in French if there was going to be a trade dependency between France and Tunisia, but he also knew that that would limit the infiltration of religion into the curriculum. And then there are many, many other things that he did that have survived. For example, a Tunisian student must complete 2 years of philosophy before she graduates from high school. Again, that was the case in 1958, it's the case today. Darwinism is taught in Tunisian schools. So it is no surprise that Tunisians grow up with an appreciation for the culture of debate, the culture of critical thinking, the culture of being able to reach compromises in various situations that they find themselves in. And finally, the system was co-educational from the get-go. So Tunisian boys and girls learned together and learned to respect one another as equals from an early age throughout their educational journey. This is, again, I'm trying to give you a little bit of a synopsis of what's in the book. I'm not giving away too much from the book. The book has a lot more rich detail in it. So I want you to get the book and I want you to read the book. But nonetheless, this is, then I'll end with a couple of other thoughts and then we'll open it up for discussion. Some of this, what I've shared, may not be very surprising to some of you. Some of it was not surprising to me. What was incredibly surprising was how much had happened before independence and before Bourguiba. So far, you might think that I'm giving Bourguiba a lot of credit. He deserves a lot of credit. He was a visionary leader. He was also an authoritarian ruler. He abused human rights. He stayed in power for way too long. And we haven't talked about Ben Ali. I talk about that in the book. But to me, what was surprising, and here's what I want to leave you with. Leadership under the Ottomans, Tunisia had since 1711 been a semi-autonomous province of the Ottoman Empire. The Husseini dynasty, which is a local dynasty, ruled over Tunisia until 1957. A year after independence, the last bey was basically rid of his title. The 19th century, a combination of close relationships with Europe, trade relationships with Europe, France, Italy, Malta, the United Kingdom to some extent, openness to Europe across the Mediterranean that was facilitated by the Napoleonic invasion of Egypt at the turn of the century. All of these factors contributed to a great deal of exchange, if you will, with Europe that took place in the 19th century. The Ottoman Empire was beginning to decline, and then we had the introduction of the Tanzimat, right? The reforms that came out of Istanbul in two phases. We also were very fortunate in that the 19th century saw a series of Ottoman leaders who were local, from Ahmed Bey to Muhammad Bey to Sadiq Bey, who implemented reforms in Tunisia, many of those reforms influenced by the British and the French, that included the abolitionism, the abolishing of slavery, which was done in 1846 in 3 decrees between 1842 and 1846. Tunisia abolished slavery 19 years before the United States did, 2 years before France did. In 1857, it implemented Ahd al-Aman, convent of sanctuary convents, that gave equal protection to everybody who's resident in Tunisia, because the French, the Italians, the British were interested in protecting the rights of the Christian and Jewish citizens. In 1861, there was a constitution that was adopted. It didn't last for very long, but nonetheless, it was there for a couple of years. So leadership played a very big role during the 19th century. But the most lasting and the most important legacy of that leadership of the 19th century was that it gave room for intellectual leadership that saw the introduction of secular education in the form of the Bardo Academy in 1840, Sadiqi College in 1875, the works of Ahmed ibn Abi Diyaf, Khair al-Din al-Tunisi, which gave birth to a group of intellectuals, les jeunes Tunisiens, who included Sheikh Mohammed Sanusi, that included Abdelaziz Ta'albi and so on, who interacted with Muhammad Abdo, in particular Muhammad Abdo, but also later on Qasim Amin and Hisham Rida, less so with Al-Afghani. But in my opinion, and what I talk about quite a bit in the book, is they differed from the movement of Al-Nahda that emanated out of Cairo in a number of respects. One, their reform movement in Tunisia was far more expansive, whereas Tahtawi and then Afghani and Abdo and all of them were primarily concerned with the reconciliation of Islam with Western ideas and sciences. In Tunisia, they were concerned with that, but they were also concerned with constitutionalism, and they were concerned with the advancement of the rights of women, which only Qasim Amin really advocated in a real sense in Egypt. One. Two, whereas Muhammad Abdo met with his students in his apartment, away from the eyes of the state and away from the eyes of Al-Azhar in particular, many of those reformers were Islamic scholars at Al Zaytuna, which saw tensions between traditionalists and the modernists. Al-Tahir Haddad, who in 1930 wrote a treatise, Imra'atuna fi al-Sharia wal-Mujtama, in which he advocated for the end of polygamy, for equal rights for women. He even advocated for abortion under certain circumstances. At the time, he was thought a heretic. But when Bourguiba liberated Tunisia in 1956, his Code de Statut Personnel was basically a codification into law of the work of Tahir Haddad. The third biggest difference was that the reform movement that started in the 19th century in Tunisia continued. It gave birth to the nationalist movement. Bourguiba was very much a product of that reform movement, but he was also a product of the French education system. Whereas in Egypt and elsewhere in the region, we saw the abandonment, the death of the reform movement, and its replacement with the Muslim Brotherhood, militarism, and pan-Arabism. So I'll end on this note that Tunisia cannot serve as a model for the rest of the Arab world, not immediately, because the ingredients that have allowed it to transition into the society that it is today, relatively liberal, more open, more democratic than elsewhere in the region, those ingredients had been in the making for a very, very long time. But I do also argue that there are perhaps valuable lessons that can be learned from the Tunisian example, and I hope that we pay attention. I was with Omar Razaz yesterday, and I didn't have to plead with him, because in him I think we have an enlightened Minister of Education. But if we don't start attacking those problems, then I don't think that the future holds much promise. Thank you.
Okay. We have about 15 minutes for Q's and A's. We're going to take a couple, and then Dr. Masri will answer, and then another 2 or 3. And we'll take it from there. صفوان will be signing some books at the end. If you'd like to purchase your copy, we encourage you to do that. Okay, please. تفضل. هناك.
Yes.
And may I please ask you to keep your question limited to a minute? Sure. We would really appreciate it.
Try with this depth.
We'll
make it in 2 minutes. 2 minutes.
هي الشطارة بدقيقة.
Okay. There are some facts in Tunisia, maybe for the time's sake, and I didn't read the book. The Ministers of Interior hub is keeping in Tunis for the last 30 years. That may be a factor to consider of the role of Tunis. The second thing, Michael Moore in his latest movie 2016, Where to Invade Next, he chose Tunis, one of 8 countries, to learn from to develop the US. And he talked to a lady there, very inspirational. The other thing is that Tunis is not one Tunis. I was part of a World Health Survey 2003 from WHO Geneva. It tells you the spectrum from south to Qayrawan up to north. Tunis, the city, is the elitists who think they are French but living in Tunis. But the others started exporting to Iraq, to Syria, some revolutionaries. My question is, George W. Bush had a plan budgeted in 2006 to use Tunisia as a democratizing model for the Arab world, Middle East actually. Then that plan was halted. That is a big question. Why is this model for democratizing? Thank you.
One more from this section, a woman.
Allow me to say, Dr. صفوان, today, your presentation really makes me feel home when I was in Sweden, because we were enlightened with such great performance like yourself today. So thank you so much. But nevertheless, in addition also, your emphasis on the labor unions also brings back the issue of Sweden. because myself, as an expert on Swedish mediation, and the thing is that labor unions, labor courts, really enhance the process of transforming the country into a culture of peace, dialogue, and mediation. Has this been a part of the labor union experience in Tunisia? Did they have any kind of labor courts, dialogue, listening, which help to solve disputes peacefully, and even if there is escalation? And the second question is that somehow you didn't highlight the role of Tunisia being a francophone. I mean, we cannot really exclude the idea that the Tunisian people were exposed to the French literature, to the French philosophies, to the French philosophers. I mean, this is really enlightening to the nation. Thank you.
تفضل, please.
Hello, sir. Thank you. Hello. It's fine. Thank you so much for this awesome. Whoa. Thank you. Hello. There. Hello. First of all, I want to thank you for an awesome lecture. Thank you so much for coming today. I just had one question about sort of what literatures or people you're speaking to in terms of the arguments that you're making with regards to Tunisia versus Egypt, for instance. What is your response to those who forward, I suppose, more structural arguments looking at the relationship, for instance, between the military and politics in contemporary Egypt, so that we don't necessarily have to go back 150 years to explain the differences? Thank you.
Great. Thank you. And I think the last two questions actually have a intersection between them. I'm not privy to what George W. Bush's plans were, so I'm not sure that I can comment about that. But I will say that I totally agree with you that Tunisia, even though it's not a vast country, but the interior and the south of the country is quite different from the coast in a number of respects. Most importantly, economically. And this is an old story. So in 1864, for example, there were riots down in Qasreen in the interior of the country over taxation. This tension had always existed. And I talk in the book about exactly what you're saying. I talk about the coastal identity being more Mediterranean, the interior identity, especially along the borders with Algeria and with Libya, being more Islamic and more Arab. That is certainly the case. But I do still say that there are commonalities in a Tunisian identity overall. Part of those commonalities is the education system. So in Tunisia, by the way, I mean, at least historically, things are changing and things under Ben Ali deteriorated. In Tunisia, everybody goes to public school. Private school is for those who fail public schools. Private school is for those who are not capable of performing well in public schools. So everybody, Zitti, gets the same education, the same exposure to, and I did talk about the Francophone nature of the education system. I mean, Francophone is a loaded term, so I didn't use that, but it is certainly the exposure to French philosophers, but as well as important Arab and Muslim historical figures and philosophers. Let's not forget that Tunisia produced Ibn Khaldun. Okay, it produced Ibn al-Jazzar. It produced a lot of incredibly important personalities over the centuries. So you find that balance in the Tunisian education system. The labor unions in Tunisia played very important roles throughout. They played a very important role, as I mentioned earlier, in the nationalist movement, the pro-independence movement from the French. They certainly played an incredibly important role in the revolution in terms of organizing protests. They played a very important role post the revolution. The 2013, the Quartet de Dialogue National, the four entities that came together representing lawyers, human rights activists, labor, UGTT, the labor union, and Fourth Attica, which is the organization that represents business interests. It was the labor union that led that process and that led the negotiation within government. And then, as you know, the quartet was recognized by the Nobel Peace Prize in 2015. Let's talk about Egypt, and especially the experience with the revolution. Tunisia always maintained a very small army. Tunisia got entangled under Ahmed Bey and then Mohammed Bey and given into it in the Crimean War in the middle of the 1850s. Tunisians were defeated, humiliatingly. Since that time, Tunisia maintained a very small army. The French were interested in keeping a small army. Bourguiba did not trust the army, and Bourguiba had a disdain for the militarism of Jamal Abdel Nasser and of Egypt. He did not want to get caught up in the army buildup and inter-Arab intrigue to the east. At the time that Bourguiba, in a doctor's coup, lost the presidency in 1987, the size of the Tunisian military was 35,000. Today, it's less than 40,000, okay? You look at the situation in Egypt. In Egypt, you had a history of militarism that goes back to the 19th century, to the early 19th century, right? You had, of course, the Free Officers' Coup of 1952. You had every single military leader except Mohammed Morsi since 1952 was a general in the army. Okay, so you had a huge army. In Tunisia, you had the huge labor union movement. You had a small army. In Egypt, the labor union movement started at around the same time that it started in Tunisia. But then, under Jamal Abdel Nasser, it was brought to its knees, and in 1857, it was basically reconformed as the ETUF. I forget what the acronym stands for at this moment. In 1857, and it became a tool for the regime. It did not work on the work, there was only one strike organized by ETUF during the entire 30-year rule of Hosni Mubarak. During the revolution, the army, the labor union actually sided more with the regime. So I think, in terms of contemporary Egypt-Tunisian comparison, that's a very, very important set of factors.
Thank you. تفضل أستاذ.
How can you explain three statements? First, the declaration of Al-Ghannouchi when he said that ISIS is the angry copy of Islam. The angry copy or the angry version of Islam. Secondly, thousands of Tunisians left to fight in Syria. Three, the relations between Al-Nahda and the others. Coexistence or real interaction? Thank you.
Okay. Can I answer that first before you take other questions? Yeah? Because I think, you hit on really important themes, which, again, for the purpose of brevity, I can't always get to everything. So I think you mentioned Daesh and the fighters in Daesh and the Nahda and the nature of the Nahda. Those are the two main points. So on the question of Daesh, we all know, it gets reported in the news that Tunisia has exported the largest number of fighters into Daesh, right? That's a headline-grabbing kind of news item. Although when you look at the numbers, we're talking about 5,000 compared to 4,500 from country X and 4,200 from country Y. So the numbers themselves are very small. And the differences between them, especially relative to population sizes, there is no statistically significant difference in those numbers. But nonetheless, when you're number one, you're number one. You become infamous, right? Now, how do I explain it? I have a number of explanations that intersect with one another. Before 2011, you had tens of thousands of fundamentalists, many of them, extremist, militant, in exile or in prison, right? You had forced secularization under Ben Ali. Ben Ali's relationship with secularism was a very different one than Bourguiba's. Okay? After the revolution, those were released into society. Many of them, and this is corroborated with interviews that were held by a number of research organizations, many of them felt that they did not belong in Tunisia, the Tunisia that they were released into. It wasn't familiar to them. It was not conducive to their thinking and to their ideology. Also, Ben Ali worked very hard to erase the legacy of Bourguiba. Okay? The legacy of Bourguiba is the nationalist legacy. It's the independence, anti-colonial legacy of Tunisia. There was a loss of a sense of nationhood under Ben Ali that many who came back into Tunisian society felt. 3, in Nahda, which I'll come back to, between 2011 2013, when it was in government, it did not control what happened in mosques. Okay? Before then and since then, preachers have to be trained by the state. The mosque is regulated. Okay? The mosque is where recruitment of Daesh fighters is most rampant, and during that period there was none. Porous borders with Libya. 80% of Tunisians who fought for Daesh were trained in Libyan military camps. Okay, so I think you take all of those factors together, and you sort of appreciate what it's about. I'll give you an anecdote. Hazem Al-Amin, who writes for Al-Nahar, did a series of interviews with former Daesh fighters who have no Daesh to fight for anymore, and he ends an article with an interview with the Tunisian fighter asking him if he was going back to Tunis. And the Tunisian Daesh fighter responds to Hazem, no, I'm going to Lebanon. My wife is Lebanese. She wears the niqab. In Tunis, she cannot wear the niqab. Tunis is not where I feel that we belong. We're moving to Lebanon. It's simplistic, and it's anecdotal, but at least it gives you a window into that. And Nahda is a very different animal, I think. In Nahda, Rashid Ghannouchi would tell you that he is product of Zaytuna reformist thinking. And Nahda did not come into being with the same objectives as Muslim Brotherhood. And the Muslim Brotherhood, of course, changed course. Hassan al-Banna was not the militant Sayyid Qutb that we saw later on in the evolution of the Muslim Brotherhood. And Nahda had an expansive agenda. It had an economic, political, social agenda. And Nahda did not have a holy agenda associated with it the way that the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, does. Rashid al-Ghannouchi spent 22 years in exile, during which he was exposed to great Western thinkers, where from exile he also talked about maintaining all the advances that had been made to the rights of women. Now, when he came back, and the Nahda came into power. In 2013, I met with him, after they withdrew from government, and he said, we were not going to make the mistake of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. There are some who argue that Rashid al-Ghannouchi is not only the most brilliant politician in Tunisia, he's the only real politician in Tunisia. So he adapted, and Nahda democratized, and Nahda paid attention to the moods and to the reactions on the streets. Last year, as you know, they dropped Islamism from their label. They've now redefined themselves as a party of Muslim Democrats. So I think the evolution of Nahda, before the revolution, but certainly after the revolution, is a key factor for understanding Tunisia and where it is today.
So صفوان, I know, I think we have some of the administrators pressing us to close. So I'm going to use my privilege as the introducer here, unless I see other questions from the audience, to ask you a final one, and you can take it as a multiple choice. إذا بدك تختصر الوقت.
She's going to make up for the lovely introduction, huh?
So the events of the past month of September 2017 in Tunisia, one of them being the the passing of the economic law that lets some of the officials off the hook without taking them to trial, the cabinet reshuffle that brought back to government some of the figures with connections to Ben Ali, and finally the postponement of the municipal elections till, at least I understand,
February.
March 2018. Is that a slowdown in the democratic process, or is it a backtracking?
Okay. So I'm going to say none of the above. I'm going to give you perhaps a bit of a nuanced answer. I mean, remember that I said early on in the talk that I'm more interested in understanding how Tunisia got to where it is today, right? Without attempting to predict what the future holds. I also said that Tunisia's democracy is very fragile. It's under tremendous stress, right? So that's what I would say. It's under tremendous stress. And that stress comes from three major areas. One is the economy. And again, that's an age-old problem. It is what drove people to the revolution. And by the way, it didn't start on December 17, 2010. It started a long time before then, in particular in 2008 with the Gafsa riot. So it had been building up. For the first time since the revolution, the economy is, the GDP growth is expected to exceed 2% for the rest of this year and next year. But the economy is a problem, and corruption as part of that economy is a big problem. And as you probably know, I'm on a panel on Wednesday in Washington with the Carnegie Endowment, with Marwan and other colleagues around the release of the report by Carnegie Endowment on that topic. Second is the issue of security. There's greater control over the borders with Libya. There's greater security coordination within and Tunisia and with external partners, but that still poses a threat. And then thirdly is political stability. So there are concerns in Tunisia about a greater centralization of power in the hands of the president of the country. There has been major concern with the reconciliation law that was passed last month by Parliament, which basically gives amnesty to people who had been accused of corruption, public officials who worked under Ben Ali who were accused of corruption. That's incredibly controversial. What gives me hope is that the Manish Msameh movement, grassroots civil society movement, continues to be very active. Tunisians are taking to the streets to protest that. You also had some advances. You had Muslim women now allowed to marry outside of their religion, and according to SFC, it's not about women and it's not about Muslim, it's about citizens having equal rights. And that is seen as perhaps a distraction from the implementation of the amnesty law. The postponement of the elections is also cause for concern. I think I would not write the obituary for Tunisia's democracy on the basis of these developments, okay? I would not. I think that it takes a very long time for democracy to be consolidated. I think that these are perhaps, it's a combination of your A and B choices. These are setbacks that need to be taken very seriously, but I think that political stability at the end is one of the things that is really required and needed. Yeah.
Good. So we'll end on an...
Samar?
So
okay. Thank you. Thank you. So the question was the relevance of this to me in terms of a personal journey. So that has many dimensions, Samar. In my visits to Tunis, I became very nostalgic for the Amman that I grew up in the 1960s and the 1970s. A Amman that was modern, was largely secular, where religion was a very private affair. Religion was a very private affair, okay? It was not shoved down your throat in the public space, frankly, which is how I feel about the Amman of today. And I found in Tunis, one, nostalgia, because it brought me back to that world that I came from, but it also reminded me, Samar, of the potential that Jordan had And it reminded me of the crimes that we committed in not realizing that potential. Okay? In 1970, we appointed in this country a founding member of the Muslim Brotherhood as Minister of Education. He had served for 7 years before then as head of the educators training department within the Ministry of Education. He declared, I've studied him carefully, he declared that the objective of a good education, okay, is to get students to de-Westernize education system, to limit the cultural influences of religious minorities. I mean, these were public statements that had been made. And I'm not saying, that was just, that's one punctuation point and that's one example. We had an opportunity to develop as a society in a very different way, and we failed at doing that, and I'm part of that failure. I am part of that failure. So to me, I mean, that was one big dimension of the personal story, but it was also very, just dealing with issues of identity and understanding the Arab world better and understanding myself and my place in the Arab world and in the world at large was part of that journey. So when I wrote the book, and really want to end on this, is I did not write this book as an academic book. It's academically founded, and I have 38 pages of references in it, right? But I did not write it for an academic audience. I wrote it for you. I wrote it for me. I wrote it so that it is accessible. And I wrote it with the notion that, especially in the world we live in today, where democracy is under stress all over the world, where liberalism is under stress all over the world, I feel it is, to me, it was very important to understand Tunisia in order to understand the Arab world. I cannot understand the world if I don't understand the world that I am from. So I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
Thank you, صفوان.